The silver-laced wolfsbane in Ilara's side burned like swallowed coals, but she forced her blistered hands to pull the heavy oak oars. The slaughtered warriors of the Iron Crown pack were waiting to cross the river. Her wooden skiff sat dangerously low in the freezing, fog-choked water, weighed down by the very wolves she had been exiled for supposedly betraying. Piercing the stifling stench of copper and charred pine, a ragged, wet gasp shattered the silence of the corpses. One of the dead was still breathing. Ilara froze. The rhythmic creak-splash of her oars ceased, leaving only the sound of the black water lapping against the hull. As the quiet Omega, the exiled ferrywoman of the cursed boundary waters, it was her sacred duty to transport the dead to the pyres of the ancestors. The dead were not supposed to breathe. She let go of the oars, instantly biting back a whimper as the sudden movement pulled at the weeping wound on her left hip. An assassin's blade had grazed her 3 days ago in the marshes, a parting gift from Beta Silas, the man who had framed her for treason. Pressing a blood-stained rag against her side, Ilara limped toward the center of the skiff. The boat rocked, the icy wind biting through her threadbare cloak. Beneath the pile of slain warriors, something shifted. A scent bled through the heavy metallic reek of death. It was faint, nearly smothered by the smell of ash and rot, but it hit Ilara's senses like a physical blow. Thunderstorm ozone and wild honey. Her breath hitched. Instinctively, her trembling, blood-crusted fingers moved to hover over her slightly swollen stomach. Inside her womb, the tiny, hidden lives fluttered in a frantic, instinctual response to that scent. "No," Ilara whispered, dropping to her knees. The rough wood scraped her skin. "It can't be." She grabbed the lifeless arm of a fallen guard and shoved the body aside. The physical exertion tore a gasp from her throat, black spots dancing in her vision as the wolfsbane in her bloodstream flared. She could not rely on Werewolf's strength. The poison had severed her connection to her wolf, leaving her with the fragile limits of a human. Panting, she wedged the handle of a broken spear beneath the next corpse, using it as a lever to roll the heavy body away. Beneath the dead lay the Alpha King, Kalen of the Iron Crown, the man who had unknowingly claimed her in the dark of the winter solstice, the man whose heirs she secretly carried, and the man who had banished her to the river when Beta Silas produced forged evidence of her treason. He was a ruin of a king. Kalen lay on his back, his midnight black armor shredded. 4 jagged crossbow bolts protruded from his chest and shoulder, the shafts glowing with the faint, sickly blue luminescence of pure silver. He was dying. The silver was tracking through his veins, turning the capillaries in his neck a bruised, necrotic purple. Yet, even battered and bleeding out, his alpha aura was a terrifying, tangible weight. It pressed down on the small boat, making the air feel dense and hard to breathe. It was a suffocating gravity that demanded submission, an ancient power struggling to keep its host alive. Ilara's mind raced, her intellect cutting through the panic. This was no battlefield casualty. Kalen was supposed to be safe within the impenetrable walls of the citadel, leagues away from the border skirmishes. If he was here, dumped among the anonymous dead, meant for the pyres, it meant a coup had taken place. Beta Silas hadn't just orchestrated a border war. He had assassinated his king and hidden the body in plain sight. It was a flawlessly cunning move. No one would ever search for the missing Alpha King among the rotting corpses ferried by a disgraced, exiled Omega. Kalen's eyes fluttered open. They were a dull, clouded gold, unfocused and dim. He couldn't see her. His massive hand twitched, his fingers scraping uselessly against the floorboards as he tried to reach for the silver bolts in his chest. "Stop," Ilara ordered, her voice a harsh rasp. She caught his wrist. His skin was burning with fever, but his grip was weak. If he pulled the bolts out now, the arterial spray would kill him in seconds. She had to stabilize him. She couldn't magically heal silver poisoning, and her own body was failing her. Working with frantic precision, Ilara pulled a pouch of dried marsh moss and crushed yarrow from her belt. She tore a strip of fabric from the hem of her cloak using her teeth and her free hand, never releasing the pressure she was applying to the worst of his wounds. She packed the yarrow tightly around the base of the silver bolts to promote rapid clotting, binding the cloth as a crude tourniquet around his shoulder. It wouldn't cure him, but it would buy him hours instead of minutes. Suddenly, a low, reverberating horn echoed through the dense fog rolling off the riverbanks. Ilara's head snapped up. Through the mist, the eerie, flickering glow of amber lanterns appeared on the muddy shoreline. Heavy boots crunched against the gravel. "Fairy woman!" A cruel, booming voice called out over the water. It was Captain Vane, Silas's chief executioner. "Bring the skiff to the banks. By order of the new regent, we are to inspect the dead for contraband." They were making sure Kaelin was truly gone. Panic seized Ilara's throat. She was trapped in the middle of the river, her oars too heavy, and her body too weak to outrun them. If they boarded the boat and found the Alpha King breathing, and found the exiled Omega nursing him, they would both be slaughtered before the fog lifted. She looked down at Kaelin, then at the pile of dead warriors beside him. There was only one way to survive. The fog was Ilara's only ally, a thick, suffocating blanket of gray that distorted sound and swallowed light. On the muddy banks, Captain Vane's men were shadows pacing behind the glow of their amber lanterns. "Fairy woman!" Vane's voice cracked like a whip across the black water. "Row to the shallows or we fire." Ilara's mind calculated the variables with desperate precision. She could not fight. Her body was trembling, the wolf's bane in her hip sending fiery tendrils of agony down her leg with every heartbeat. Kaelin lay motionless at her feet, his massive chest barely rising, the silver bolts glowing with a sickly luminescence that would give them away the moment the fog thinned. If she rowed to shore, Vane would find the Alpha King and execute them both. If she stayed, the archers would turn her skiff into a pincushion. She needed a decoy. Moving with agonizing slowness to avoid rocking the boat, Ilara unhooked the iron lantern hanging from the skiff's prow. The metal handle seared her blistered palms. She turned to the dead warrior she had rolled off Kaelin moments ago. The corpse was rigid, its armor slick with blood. Gritting her teeth against a wave of nausea, Ilara looped the lantern's leather strap tightly around the dead warrior's wrist. She dragged the body to the edge of the low-sitting skiff. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, her pregnant belly aching from the physical strain. She could not lift him. Instead, she used the shaft of the broken spear as a fulcrum against the gunwale, wedging it beneath the corpse's waist and leveraging her meager weight against the opposite end. With a sickening splash, the corpse tipped over the side, hitting the fast-moving center current. The heavy woolen cloak billowed, keeping the body afloat just enough for the lantern to bob above the surface, drifting rapidly downstream. "There!" a guard shouted from the shore. "She's making a run for the rapids. She's drifting downriver." "Fire!" Vane roared. A deadly hail of arrows hissed through the air, plunging into the water and striking the drifting corpse with dull thuds. The lantern shattered, extinguishing the light and plunging the river back into pitch darkness. Ilara didn't wait to watch. The moment the corpse hit the water, she had dropped flat on her stomach, plunging her bare hands into the freezing black river. Working entirely by touch and desperate strength, she paddled the skiff backward. She didn't fight the current. She used the river's natural eddy, guiding the boat silently into the dense, hanging roots of the weeping willows on the southern bank, moving in the exact opposite direction of her decoy. The icy water numbed her blistering hands, but she didn't stop until the skiff was swallowed entirely by the tangled willow roots and the thick curtain of marsh reeds. From the shore, Vane's voice faded. "Sweep the downstream banks. If she hits the weeping falls in the dark, the boat will shatter. Find the bodies." Ilara collapsed against the wet floorboards, her chest heaving, listening to the heavy boots crunch away on the gravel. They were gone. For now. But Vane was a meticulous predator. When he found the shattered lantern attached to a dead guard instead of the ferrywoman, he would realize he'd been tricked. He would map the eddy currents. He would double back. She had, at most, an hour. A sharp, pained rattle drew her attention back to the floorboards. Kalen was suffocating. The bruised, necrotic purple of the silver poisoning had crept up the corded muscles of his neck, branching out like spiderwebs beneath his pale skin. The scent of wild honey and thunderstorm ozone was souring, turning acrid with the smell of dying cells. His alpha aura, once a suffocating pressure, was now violently pulsing, a dying star collapsing in on itself. Her womb clenched, a sharp, instinctual ache that stole her breath. The tiny lives inside her were panicking, the biological magic of the mate bond recognizing the fading life force of their sire. "Hold on," she whispered, her voice cracking. She grabbed her single remaining oar and punted the skiff deeper into the reeds, navigating a narrow, hidden tributary that led to her sanctuary, a dilapidated smuggler's grotto, hollowed out beneath the roots of an ancient sycamore tree. The skiff bumped against a rotting wooden dock hidden in the shadows. Tying off the boat, Ilara faced her next impossible hurdle. Kalen weighed over 250 pounds of pure, dense muscle and armor. She couldn't lift him over the gunwale, let alone drag him up the muddy sloped bank into the grotto. But she was the ferrywoman. She moved heavy cargo for a living. Ilara limped onto the dock and grabbed a thick roll of heavy canvas sailcloth. She dragged it onto the skiff, wedging it tightly against Kalen's side. Using the broken spear once more, she levered his massive frame just enough to kick the canvas underneath him, rolling him until he was cocooned in the thick fabric. She tied the canvas securely with a length of braided hemp rope, then carried the slack end up the muddy bank to the heavy, rusted iron winch bolted to the base of the sycamore tree. Her hands were a ruin of blood and torn blisters, but she gripped the iron crank. She threw her entire body weight against it. The gear groaned, the rusted pawl clicking into place. Clack. Pain ripped through her wolfsbane-laced hip, dropping her to one knee. She bit through her lower lip to keep from screaming, tasting copper. For the pups, she told herself, the thought a burning mantra. For the pups. Pull. Clack. Inch by excruciating inch, the winch dragged the canvas sled out of the boat, over the dock and up the muddy embankment. It took 20 minutes of agonizing labor before she finally hauled his body into the dry, sheltered basin of the cave. Ilara collapsed beside him, her lungs burning, her muscles trembling violently. She crawled over to a small, shielded hearth in the corner and struck a flint, coaxing a meager fire to life. The dim orange light illuminated Kalen's face. He was deathly pale, sweat matting his midnight hair. She crawled back to him, pulling a hunting knife from her boot and holding the blade in the fire to sterilize it. She had to cut the silver bolts out, or he would be dead before dawn. As the blade glowed red-hot, Ilara leaned over him, her trembling fingers reaching for the first jagged bolt in his chest. Suddenly, a massive, burning hand shot up from the dark, wrapping around her throat with crushing force. Kalen's eyes snapped open. They were no longer clouded. The dull gold had ignited into a terrifying, luminous amber, filled with the feral, unhinged violence of a cornered predator. He couldn't see past the fever and the shadows, but his grip was lethal. "Traitor," the Alpha King snarled, his voice a guttural rumble that shook the stone walls of the cave. "You will die first." The crushing pressure on Ilara's windpipe was absolute. Kalen's fingers, thick as iron cables, clamped around her throat, lifting her slightly off the stone floor. Black spots instantly swarmed her vision. His eyes, burning with the feral, unfocused amber of a dying beast, held no recognition. He didn't see his mate. He saw the enemy his fever-riddled mind conjured. Ilara clawed at his wrist, her ruined, blistered hands leaving bloody smears against his pale skin. But she possessed a fraction of a human's strength, let alone an alpha's. Her lungs screamed. The tiny lives in her womb recoiled, sending a sharp, empathetic spike of terror through her nervous system. She couldn't overpower him. She had to break his physical circuit. Summoning the last dregs of her consciousness, Ilara stopped pulling at his wrist. Instead, she drove the heel of her hand directly into the yarrow-packed wound on his shoulder, grinding her palm against the jagged, protruding shaft of the silver crossbow bolt. Kalen roared, a horrific wet sound that tore from his chest. The blinding spike of agony severed his delirious focus. His grip released instantly as his nervous system overloaded, his back arching off the stone before he collapsed, convulsing as the silver poison surged. Ilara hit the floor, gasping frantically, clutching her bruised throat. She scrambled backward, coughing up blood and bile, her wolfsbane-laced hips screaming in protest. She gave herself exactly 10 seconds to breathe. If she waited any longer, Kalen's temporary surge of adrenaline would fade into terminal shock. Dragging herself back to his side, she retrieved the knife from the fire. The blade glowed a dull, angry orange. "You don't get to die," she rasped, her voice a broken croak. "Not after what you cost me." She positioned the hot blade against the torn flesh around the first bolt in his chest. Silver was toxic to wolves, preventing cellular regeneration and causing necrosis. To remove a barbed bolt, she couldn't just pull. She had to widen the entry wound to prevent the barbs from shredding his arteries on the way out. The stench of searing flesh and burning blood instantly filled the damp grotto, overpowering the scent of wild honey and thunderstorm ozone. Kalen's body bucked violently, his jaw locked in a silent scream. Ilara threw her upper body over his torso, pinning him with her meager weight, relying on the heavy canvas cocoon to keep his arms restricted. She gripped the slick, blood-soaked shaft of the bolt with her makeshift cloth tourniquet and pulled. It came free with a sickening shuck, followed by a sluggish, dark pulse of toxic blood. Ilara immediately pressed a wad of dried marsh moss into the gaping hole, applying brutal, unrelenting pressure. She repeated the agonizing process 3 more times. Cut, pull, pack. By the time the 4th and final bolt clattered against the stone floor, Ilara was weeping silent tears of pure physical exhaustion. Her hands were trembling so violently she could barely tie the linen bandages. Kalen was completely unresponsive, his breathing terrifyingly shallow. The alpha aura, once a suffocating weight in the room, had retreated entirely. It was no longer a dying star. It was a single flickering ember, barely enough to keep the cold at bay. Ilara slumped against the damp wall of the grotto, staring at the ruin of the king who had exiled her. 4 months ago, Beta Silas had presented Kalen with forged missives, claiming Ilara was feeding pack secrets to the encroaching rogue armies. Kalen, blinded by his duties and a heavily manipulated council, had stripped her of her rank and cast her out to the boundary waters. He hadn't known about the winter solstice, the dark, intoxicating night they had collided in the archives, an unacknowledged mating pool that left her carrying his heirs. She placed a bloody hand over her swollen abdomen. The frantic fluttering inside her had ceased, replaced by a slow, rhythmic pulse that seemed to sync with Kalen's failing heartbeat. The biological magic of the mate bond was a fragile tether. If he died, the shockwave through the bond could cause her body to reject the pups. She was tethered to the man who ruined her. As dawn broke, a pale gray light filtered through the dense lattice of willow roots masking the grotto's entrance. Ilara forced herself up. Survival required a fortress, and right now, she only had a damp hole in the earth, moving with deliberate, mechanical efficiency to ignore the pain in her hip. She began to mask their scent. She gathered handfuls of the wild garlic and bitter sulfur weed that grew near the cave mouth, crushing the pungent plants into a paste and smearing it along the entrance. It would camouflage the metallic tang of Kalen's blood and the distinct fading scent of his alpha aura from Vane's tracking hounds. Next, she took the 4 silver bolts. She couldn't leave them here. If Vane's men dredged the shallows and found the decoy corpse, they would search the banks for miles. She wrapped the bolts in heavy cloth, tied them to a heavy river stone, and dragged herself back to the wooden dock. The river was a calm, deceptive black glass in the morning mist. Ilara dropped the weighted package into the deepest part of the eddy current, watching it sink into the abyss. When she returned to the grotto, Kalen hadn't moved. The necrotic purple veins on his neck had stopped spreading, but they hadn't receded. The silver was out, but the poison was still in his system. His body would have to fight a grueling uphill battle to purge it, and he would be entirely helpless while it did. Ilara sat beside the meager fire, pulling a coarse blanket over her shivering shoulders. She was the quiet Omega, the disgraced fairy woman. But as she looked at the vulnerable Alpha King sleeping in the dirt, the power dynamic of the iron-crowned pack shifted in the shadows of the cave. He belonged to the river now, and in the river, Ilara was the only sovereign. For 3 days, the grotto existed in a state of suspended animation, a purgatory of damp stone and the overwhelming stench of sickness. Ilara fought a grueling, solitary war against the silver poison ravaging Kalen's body. Her own physical deterioration was becoming impossible to ignore. The wolfsbane wound on her hip wept a clear, stinging fluid, sending tremors of exhaustion down her leg. She survived on a meager diet of rivercress and the few blind cavefish she managed to trap in the shallows, hoarding the nutrient-rich marrow broth for the Alpha King. She didn't do it out of lingering loyalty. She did it because every time Kalen's breathing hitched, a terrifying, icy void threatened to open within her womb. The mate bond was a cruel parasite. If the sire perished, the shockwave would take the heirs with him. On the evening of the 3rd day, the air in the cavern shifted. The suffocating scent of necrotic tissue and sour sweat was suddenly pierced by a sharp, clear note of thunderstorm ozone. The alpha aura, which had been a dying, flickering ember, flared to life. It was fractured and jagged, lacking its usual crushing weight, but it was unmistakably conscious. Ilara, who had been grinding dried willow bark in a stone bowl, froze. From the shadows of the canvas cocoon, a deep, ragged intake of breath rattled in the quiet cave. Kalen's eyes opened. The feral, delirious amber was gone, replaced by a piercing, lucid gold. He stared at the ceiling of the grotto, his chest heaving as his mind violently reconnected with his broken body. Slowly, agonizingly, he turned his head toward the meager firelight. His gaze locked onto Ilara. Instantly, his lips peeled back in a silent snarl. His massive arms flexed as his instincts commanded him to rise, to strike the traitor who had orchestrated his downfall. But reality was a brutal master. The moment he engaged his core muscles, the 4 gaping, packed wounds in his chest and shoulder tore open. Kalen collapsed back onto the dirt with a sharp hiss of agony, his skin flushing a sickly gray. He couldn't even lift his shoulders off the ground. The realization of his absolute helplessness hit the air like a physical shockwave. "Don't move," Elara said, her voice flat, devoid of the submissive tremor a Pack Omega was expected to display before an Alpha. The silver is out, but the necrosis is still fighting the yarrow packing. If you tear the arteries, I won't be able to stop the bleeding a second time. Kalen's golden eyes burned into her, analyzing the situation with the ruthless intellect that had made him king. He took in the damp walls, the smell of the river, and finally the ruin of his own body. You, he rasped. His voice was a ruined, gravelly ruin of its former authority. You were exiled to the boundary waters, and you were supposed to be safe in the citadel, surrounded by your loyal council, Elara countered, limping slightly as she approached him, a wooden cup of water in her blistered hands. It seems we both fell victim to Beta Silas's ambition. Silas. Kalen's brow furrowed, a flash of genuine pain crossing his features before it was buried beneath alpha stoicism. He led the ambush. The border rogue attack was a diversion. My own royal guard. They put the bolts in me, and then they dumped you in my skiff with the rest of the dead, intending for me to ferry you to the pyres without looking closely. Elara finished, kneeling just out of his reach. She set the cup down near his hand. A flawless coup. He removes the king and frames the rogues, all while avoiding the suspicion of a missing body. Kalen stared at her, his jaw clenching. He remembered the forged letters. He remembered stripping her of her rank, casting her out into the freezing mud. Why am I alive, ferrywoman? If you are the traitor Silas claimed you to be, you should have let the river take me, or finish the job yourself. Because I am not a traitor, Elara said coldly. She met his dominating gaze without flinching, using the physical reality of her environment to anchor her. And because dead men make terrible leverage. It was a lie, a necessary shield to hide the truth growing in her womb. Kalen's nostrils flared, taking a deep, shuddering breath. He was searching for the scent of deceit. But as he inhaled, his golden eyes suddenly widened, the pupils dilating until they nearly swallowed the irises. He caught her scent. Beneath the harsh tang of wild garlic and river mud, there was the familiar, delicate scent of crushed lilies that he remembered from the archives on the winter solstice. But it was different now. It was richer, layered with a deep, milky sweetness, a protective, maternal pheromone that instinctually commanded an alpha to bare his throat and defend. The fractured alpha aura in the room suddenly shifted, curling around Elara not as a weapon but as a heavy, protective blanket. Your scent, Kalen breathed, his voice losing its harsh edge, replaced by a profound, disorienting confusion. What is... I changed my diet to survive the marshes, Elara interrupted sharply, shifting her heavy wool cloak to thoroughly obscure her midsection. She stood up, ignoring the agonizing spike of pain in her hip. She could not let him realize the truth, not when he was still the man who had discarded her. Drink the water. I have to check the perimeter. She turned her back on the helpless king, forcing herself to walk evenly toward the narrow tunnel that led to the riverbank. When she pushed through the dense curtain of willow roots, the frigid morning air hit her lungs. Elara moved with absolute silence, using the heavy foliage as cover, navigating up the steep, muddy embankment to her vantage point overlooking the river bend. What she saw made her blood run cold. A mile downstream, the morning mist was clearing. Moored against the banks were 3 flat-bottomed military barges. But it wasn't the boats that terrified her. It was the massive wire mesh cages sitting on the decks. Captain Vane hadn't just brought archers. He had brought the bloodhounds, massive, genetically mutated tracking wolves, specifically bred to hunt down rogue shifters. Vane was a meticulous, cunning predator. He had realized the floating corpse was a decoy, mapped the river's back currents, and was now systematically sweeping the shores, and the wind was blowing directly from the grotto toward them. The bloodhounds were a crime against nature, grotesque behemoths bred in the citadel's darkest fighting pits. Even from a mile away, Ilara could see their hulking, unnatural musculature, their coats patchy and scarred. One of the beasts, a massive brute with a severe underbite, suddenly planted its front paws on the barge's railing. It threw its scarred snout into the air, nostrils flaring as it caught the wind. A chilling, guttural bay echoed down the river valley. Ilara didn't waste a second. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she slid down the muddy embankment, ignoring the white-hot flare of agony in her wolfsbane-laced hip. The garlic and sulfur paste smeared on the grotto's entrance was designed to mask a static scent, but the shifting morning wind was betraying them, pulling the faint, lingering ozone of Kalen's alpha aura directly toward the water. She shoved through the dense curtain of willow roots, tumbling into the dim grotto. Kalen was no longer on his back, driven by an alpha's terrifying, irrational instinct to defend his territory. He had managed to roll onto his side, his massive arm trembling violently as he tried to drag himself toward the entrance. The exertion was catastrophic. The crude yarrow packing on his chest had soaked through, fresh, dark blood sluggishly weeping down his pale torso. "Are you trying to kill us both?" Ilara hissed, dropping to her knees beside him. "Hounds," Kalen ground out, his voice a gravelly, breathy wheeze. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his golden eyes blown wide with the panic of a caged predator. "I can hear them, splashing in the shallows. And they can smell you," Ilara snapped. She pushed hard against his uninjured shoulder, forcing him flat onto his back. He didn't have the strength to resist, collapsing with a sharp, involuntary hiss of pain. "Your aura is leaking. Pull it back." "I can't." It was a devastating admission from a king. The silver poison had ravaged his nervous system. The suffocating weight of his power was fractured, pulsing out of his control. Ilara scrambled toward the meager fire crackling in the hearth. If she couldn't stop the scent from escaping, she had to corrupt the air current entirely. She grabbed handfuls of wet peat from the cave floor, along with the remaining bundles of bitter sulfur weed and a damp, rotting log of willow wood. She dumped it all directly onto the glowing coals. Instantly, a thick, acrid cloud of white smoke billowed into the confined space. It smelled of rotting vegetation, acidic marsh gas, and blinding, eye-watering sulfur. The heavy smoke naturally rose, seeking the draft, filtering directly out through the willow roots at the entrance to meet the oncoming wind. "Get down," Ilara coughed, her eyes streaming. "Keep your face against the dirt. The clean air is at the bottom." Kalen was already struggling to breathe, his ruined chest heaving. Ilara threw herself down beside him, pressing her cheek against the cold, damp earth. The space was incredibly tight. To avoid the toxic smoke blanketing the upper half of the cave, she had to press her body flush against his uninjured side. Outside, the heavy, rhythmic splashing grew deafening. The hounds were in the tributary, wading through the reeds. Snap. Crunch. Heavy boots hit the mud just outside their root curtain. "Seek, beast! Seek the king!" Captain Vane's voice barked, so close Ilara could hear the leather of his armor creaking. A massive, wet snout shoved through the bottom of the willow roots, mere feet from where they lay in the dirt. The hound inhaled sharply, drawing the grotto's air into its hypersensitive lungs. Ilara stopped breathing. She squeezed her eyes shut. Beside her, Kalen's chest rumbled with a deep, instinctual growl of warning. Panic seized her. If he made a sound, they were dead. Acting purely on survival instinct, Ilara shifted her weight, throwing her leg over his thighs to pin him, and clamped her blistered, blood-stained hand fiercely over his mouth and nose. Kalen's golden eyes snapped to hers in the gloom. He was entirely paralyzed beneath her, entirely at her mercy. The hound at the entrance took a second, massive lungful of the air and inhaled a direct, undiluted stream of the acidic sulfur and peat smoke. The beast recoiled violently, unleashing a high-pitched sneeze that shook the roots, followed by a series of miserable, hacking whines. It scrambled backward, thrashing in the shallow water to get away from the blinding, burning marsh gas. Useless mutt, Vane cursed, the sound of his boot kicking the animal echoing sharply. It's a dead end. Just a rotting root-hollow venting swamp gas. Inside the grotto, Elara didn't dare move. She kept her hand clamped over Kylan's mouth, her chest pressed tightly against his shoulder, her pregnant belly resting just against his ribs. Beneath her hand, Kylan had stopped trying to growl. In the suffocating, enclosed space, inches from the damp earth, the smoke couldn't mask the truth of proximity. Kalen's nose was buried against the pulse point of her wrist and the collar of her tunic. Beneath the harsh tang of sweat, fear, and sulfur, the scent hit him like a physical blow. Crushed lilies from the archives on the winter solstice, and layered over it, thick and undeniable, the heavy, sweet, milky pheromones of an omega carrying pups. Kalen's pupils dilated so wide his eyes looked entirely black. The fractured, chaotic alpha aura that had been wildly pulsing suddenly snapped into a laser-focused, terrifyingly dense field of gravity. It didn't push Elara away. It wrapped around her, heavy and possessive, cocooning her stomach. The boots outside were retreating, but the real danger had just awakened in the cave. Elara slowly pulled her hand away from his mouth, her breathing ragged. She tried to roll off him, to put distance between them, but Kalen's massive, heavy hand shot out. He didn't grab her throat this time. His thick fingers wrapped gently but immovably around her waist, pinning her to his side. The winter solstice, Kalen breathed, his gravelly voice dropping to a terrifying, vibrating whisper. His eyes dropped to the heavy wool cloak she had used to hide her swelling stomach. The girl in the dark. It was you. Elara's blood ran completely cold. Before she could form a lie, Vane's voice echoed from the river, carrying a tactical command that sealed their fate. They didn't make it to the falls, Vane shouted to his lieutenants. Drop anchor at the mouth of every tributary. Set up the net barricades. They're hiding in the marsh, and they can't survive the rot forever. We starved the river out. The command to starve them out echoed down the river, but inside the suffocating, smoke-filled grotto, the true battle was silent. Kalen's thick fingers remained clamped around Elara's waist, his grip immovable. His thumb rested just above the curve of her hip, radiating a blistering heat through the damp wool of her cloak. The heavy, possessive gravity of his alpha aura had condensed entirely around her, a suffocating blanket of protection that made her lungs seize. Mine, Kalen rumbled, the word vibrating deep in his ruined chest. It wasn't a romantic declaration. It was a primal, territorial absolute born of instinct and shock. Elara's heart hammered a frantic rhythm, but she refused to yield to the biological command woven into his voice. She shoved hard against his uninjured shoulder, using her body weight and leverage to break his hold. Weakened by the silver necrosis and unable to engage his torn pectoral muscles, Kalen's grip slipped. Elara scrambled backward, gasping for the clean air pooling near the dirt floor, her hand instinctively coming up to shield her stomach. "Do not mistake biology for a bond, Your Grace," Elara said, her voice shaking but her words cutting like ice. "You lost the right to claim anything the night you signed my exile order." Kalen gritted his teeth, the muscles in his jaw ticking as he tried and failed to prop himself up on his elbows. The raw, packed wounds on his chest wept fresh fluid at the exertion. "Silas gave me sworn affidavits. evidence of your scent on rogue borders. I was protecting the pack. You were protecting your political stability, Ilara interrupted, her eyes flashing with a fierce, quiet rage. She didn't shout. The hounds were still too close. I am a low-ranking Omega. Beta Silas is a warlord with half the council in his pocket. When he demanded a scapegoat, you didn't look closer because it was convenient for you to believe him. You cast me out into the freezing mud to die. The truth landed with the weight of an anvil. Kalen's golden eyes darkened, the pupils blowing wide with a sickening mixture of guilt and horror. He looked at her blistered, blood-crusted hands, the gaunt hollows of her cheeks, and finally the heavy cloak hiding the pups he had unknowingly sired. His aura fractured, the scent of thunderstorm ozone souring with profound self-loathing. Ilara, save your breath. You need it to heal, she commanded coldly, turning away from him. She couldn't afford the luxury of anger right now. Her intellect was already dissecting Vane's blockade. She limped to the meager fire, pulling the stone bowl of fish marrow broth from the coals. Vane is dropping anchor and setting net barricades. He knows the geography of this river. He knows that if we are trapped in the marsh, we will eventually starve, or the cold will take us. We need a messenger, Kalen rasped, his eyes tracking her every movement. If I can get word to Commander Thorn at the northern garrison, he will march on Silas. Thorn is 3 days' ride from here, and the river is sealed, Ilara replied. She knelt beside him, holding the wooden cup of warm broth. Drink. The silver is purged, but your cellular regeneration needs protein to rebuild the tissue. You have to be able to walk by tomorrow night. Kalen looked at the crude cup, then up at her defiant face. He didn't argue. He forced his heavy head up just enough to drink, swallowing the bitter, rich broth with a grimace. Why tomorrow night? He asked, his voice a gravelly rasp. Because this is a smuggler's grotto, Ilara explained, her mind working furiously. There is a secondary exit, a submerged tunnel the old river rats called the rot sink. It bypasses the tributary completely and dumps out into the deep water beyond the net barricades. Kalen's brow furrowed. Submerged. For how long? 2 minutes of swimming in pitch-black freezing water, fighting an undertow, Ilara said flatly. I can make it. But if you can't hold your breath and kick, the current will pin you against the bedrock and drown you. It was a brutal reality. The Alpha King, once capable of holding his breath for 20 minutes in the training pools, was currently struggling to draw a full breath through his ruined chest. For the rest of the day, a tense, fraught silence consumed the cavern. Ilara meticulously cleaned her wolfsbane wound, biting down on a leather strap as she packed the stinging flesh with fresh moss. Kalen watched her in silence, his golden eyes burning with a helpless, protective agony. Every time she winced, his aura spiked, a phantom limb trying to shield her from a pain he could not reach. He spent the hours pushing his body to its absolute limits, forcing himself to take deeper and deeper breaths, testing the integrity of the yarrow packing. He used the wall of the cave to push himself into a sitting position, his face graying with the effort, sweat pouring down his neck. He refused to be a liability. As night fell, the temperature plummeted. Ilara huddled near the embers, shivering violently as the damp cold of the marsh seeped into her bones. Suddenly, the heavy wool blanket was dragged from Callan's legs and draped over her shoulders. She looked up, startled. Kalen had managed to drag himself 3 feet across the dirt, his broad, bare chest heaving. He didn't try to touch her, respecting the boundary she had drawn, but he placed his massive body between her and the draft coming from the entrance. I will not let you drown, he swore, his voice barely a whisper, thick with a desperate sincerity. I will get you and the pups through the sink, even if it stops my heart. Before Ilara could respond to the raw vulnerability in his eyes, the air in the grotto shifted violently. The lingering, sulfuric stench of their smokescreen was suddenly overpowered by a new, terrifying scent. It wasn't the damp smell of marsh gas. It was the dry, crackling scent of burning reeds and charred willow wood. Ilara scrambled to the root curtain, peering out into the darkness. A mile down the river, the horizon was glowing with a harsh, angry orange light. Thick, black smoke was rolling over the water, blotting out the stars. Captain Vane wasn't going to wait to starve them out. He was a cunning tactician. He knew the wind blew directly inland at night. He had ordered his men to set fire to the dry winter reeds along the riverbanks, creating a massive, sweeping wall of flame designed to flush any hidden refugees directly into the open water and right into his waiting nets. "The wind is pushing it fast," Ilara choked out, her lungs already burning from the thickening smoke. She turned back to Kalen, her eyes wide with terror. They didn't have until tomorrow night. "Kalen, get up," she ordered, her voice cracking. "We have to take the rot sink now." The grotto was rapidly transforming into a clay oven. The roar of the approaching inferno sounded like a monstrous, rushing waterfall, consuming the oxygen and replacing it with a thick, choking ash that tasted of charred bone. Ilara didn't wait for Kalen to find his footing. She grabbed his uninjured wrist and hauled him toward the deepest, narrowest fissure at the back of the cavern. Kalen moved with a heavy, lumbering limp, his massive frame hunched as he desperately tried to protect his torn chest from the exertion. Every labored breath he took was accompanied by a wet, rattling wheeze. They reached the end of the fissure where the ground dropped away entirely into a sinkhole of pitch-black, stagnant-smelling water. "The rot sink," Ilara coughed, her eyes streaming. "It's a natural siphon. The current pulls down for 30 feet before the tunnel levels out and spits you into the deep river channel." Kalen stared at the black water, his golden eyes blown wide. The heat radiating from his skin was feverish, his alpha aura pulsing in erratic, terrified spikes. "Ilara, my chest. The water pressure." "I know," she said, her voice cracking with desperation. She gripped his face with her blistered hands, forcing him to look at her. "If you try to swim with your arms, you will tear your arteries open and bleed out in the dark. You have to lock your arms to your sides. Let the downdraft pull you. Only kick when you feel the rock turn smooth. Do you understand?" "I am too heavy," Kalen rasped, a single bloody tear tracking through the soot on his face. "I will drag you down. Go, save them." He looked pointedly at her cloaked stomach. "We go together, or we burn together, Your Grace." Ilara snarled, the fierce, unyielding protectiveness of a mother stripping away the last of her omega submissiveness. "Take a breath. Now." Behind them, the curtain of willow roots at the cave entrance burst into blinding, white-hot flames. Kalen inhaled, a shallow, agonizing gulp of smoke-tainted air, and Ilara threw herself into the freezing abyss, dragging the Alpha King with her. The shock of the water was a physical blow. It was liquid ice, instantly paralyzing Ilara's lungs and driving a million needles of agony into the wolfsbane wound on her hip. Total, suffocating darkness swallowed them. True to her word, the current was a violent, unseen hand. It seized them, dragging them violently downward in a dizzying spiral. Ilara kept her eyes shut, fighting the primal panic screaming in her brain. She felt Kalen's massive bulk beside her, a dense, sinking weight. The frigid water immediately stripped the heat from his body, and she could feel the frantic, heavy thrum of his failing heartbeat vibrating through the water. 10 seconds. Her chest began to burn. The pressure built against her eardrums. In her womb, the pups went terrifyingly still, a biological defense mechanism against the freezing temperature. 20 seconds. Ilara's shoulder scraped against jagged limestone. She flinched, losing a precious bubble of air. The current was pushing them too fast. Then the turbulent, tumbling sensation stopped. The water grew terrifyingly smooth, flowing rapidly in a horizontal line. They had hit the tunnel. Ilara kicked her legs, trying to propel herself forward, but her left leg cramped violently. The wolfsbane venom, dormant in the cold, suddenly seized her muscles in a rigid, agonizing spasm. She gasped instinctively, swallowing a mouthful of freezing, brackish water. She was drowning. She began to thrash, her spatial awareness completely gone. But before the current could pin her against the ceiling of the tunnel, a massive, heavy force slammed into her from behind. Kalen. He hadn't locked his arms to his sides as instructed. Ignoring the catastrophic damage to his torn chest muscles, he reached out in the pitch black and locked his thick forearm around her waist. He didn't try to pull her. He used his massive, muscular legs, bred for sprinting across battlefields, to kick with explosive, desperate power. He became a living torpedo, shielding her body with his own, taking the brutal scrapes of the low stone ceiling against his back. Through the mate bond, Ilara felt the exact moment Kalen's yarrow packing washed away. She felt the sickening tear of muscle, the blinding white-hot agony as his wounds opened directly into the freezing water. Yet his grip on her never faltered. The alpha aura, stripped of all dominance and reduced to pure sacrificial protection, wrapped around her like a shield of static electricity. 40 seconds. Ilara's vision was completely black. Her lungs were spasming. Suddenly, the pressure changed. The claustrophobic current diffused, pushing them upward. They broke the surface. Ilara gasped, inhaling a massive, shuddering breath of clean, freezing air. She coughed violently, expelling river water as she thrashed in the deep, rolling current. Beside her, Kalen surfaced with a horrifying, gurgling choke. His arms slipped from her waist. Without the buoyancy of his heavy lungs, which were currently failing, he immediately began to sink. "No!" Ilara screamed, plunging her hands into the water and catching the collar of his ruined tunic. She kicked furiously with her one good leg, dragging his dead weight toward the rocky shoreline a few yards away. She hauled him into the shallow gravel, collapsing half in, half out of the water. Kalen lay on his side, coughing up a sickening mixture of river water and dark, arterial blood. The 4 holes in his chest were fully exposed, weeping freely into the freezing rain that had begun to fall. The silence on the iron deck was absolute, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain and the mechanical hiss of the dreadnought's steam vents. Ilara stared at Kalen's still chest. The catastrophic blood loss and the lingering shock of the silver necrosis had finally stopped his massive heart. To the soldiers kneeling in a perimeter around them, the Alpha King was gone. But Ilara was not just a grieving widow. She was the fairy woman. She knew the exact threshold between life and death, and Kalen had not yet crossed it. "Get up!" Ilara roared, her voice tearing through the freezing downpour, shattering the soldiers' stunned paralysis. "You have bloodbinders and adrenaline in the ship's infirmary. Bring them to the deck. Now." The sheer, undeniable authority in her voice, amplified by the biological mandate of the royal pups she carried, snapped the soldiers out of their trance. 2 of Vane's former lieutenants scrambled to their feet, sprinting toward the lower decks. Ilara threw herself over Kalen's ruined chest. She couldn't afford to worry about the torn muscles or the raw, weeping bullet holes. If his brain was deprived of oxygen for more than 4 minutes, not even an alpha's cellular regeneration could bring him back. She locked her blistered, bleeding hands together, centered them over his sternum, and drove her body weight down. Ribs cracked beneath her palms, the sound sickeningly loud. But she didn't stop. She pumped furiously, forcing the remaining blood to circulate through his massive frame. Her wolfsbane-laced hips screamed, her lungs burned, and her vision spotted with black dots of exhaustion. But she refused to yield. "You do not get to leave me with a continent to run," she ground out, tears of absolute defiance mixing with the freezing rain. The lieutenants returned, sliding across the slick deck with brass syringes of epinephrine and heavy canvas bandages. "Into the heart," Ilara commanded, not breaking her rhythm. "Drive it through the chest wall." The soldier didn't hesitate. He plunged the long needle directly into Kalen's chest, deploying the massive dose of adrenaline. But Kalen remained still. His body was too hollowed out, the mate bond too fractured by the trauma to catch the spark. There was only one biological failsafe left. Ilara stopped compressions. She collapsed against Kalen's neck, her face pressing into the cold, pulseless hollow beneath his jaw. She didn't kiss him. Acting on pure primal instinct, she opened her mouth, bared her dull, human-like teeth, and bit down brutally onto his scent gland. It was a full, undeniable claiming bite. As her teeth broke his skin, she forcefully pushed every ounce of her will, her scent, and the frantic, instinctual terror of the pups in her womb directly into the severed mate bond. It was a biological shockwave, a massive, concentrated dose of maternal pheromones and unbroken tethering magic, demanding that the sire return to his pack. For 3 terrifying seconds, nothing happened. Then, beneath Ilara's bloody hands, a massive, violent shudder racked Kalen's frame. His back arched off the steel deck as his heart seized the adrenaline and the bond's command, misfiring, stuttering, and finally locking into a heavy, thundering, chaotic rhythm. Kalen dragged in a horrific, ragged gasp of air, his golden eyes snapping open, blindly searching the rain. "We have a pulse!" the lieutenant shouted in disbelief. "Bind his chest," Ilara ordered, falling back onto the iron grates, completely spent. "Make full steam for the northern garrison. If he dies on the way, I will personally throw every one of you to the river." 6 months later, the air in the high balcony of the citadel smelled of sun-warmed stone, crushed lilies, and the steady, calm hum of thunderstorm ozone. Ilara stood at the marble balustrade looking out over the sprawling valleys of the iron-crowned territory. She was dressed in the deep crimson silks of the Luna, the fabric draping elegantly over the heavy, undeniable curve of her 3rd trimester pregnancy. Behind her, the heavy oak doors of the Solar creaked open. Kalen stepped onto the balcony. The Alpha King was alive, but the river had extracted its toll. He moved with a heavy, pronounced limp, relying on a thick, silver-capped mahogany cane. The necrotic silver poisoning had permanently scarred the left side of his chest and shoulder, thick bands of twisted tissue that even his alpha healing could not erase. He was no longer the indestructible warlord, but the quiet, imposing gravity of his aura remained intact. "The northern and eastern rogue factions have signed the new treaties," Kalen said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble. He moved to stand beside her, leaning heavily on the balustrade. "Your trade proposals for the boundary waters sealed the negotiation. They trust the fairy woman. They do not entirely trust me." "They will learn," Ilara said mildly, not looking away from the horizon. Kalen turned to look at her. The reverence in his golden eyes was absolute. There was no suffocating dominance in his gaze, only the profound respect of a king looking at his equal. He had spent the last 6 agonizing months recovering, learning the extent of Silas's manipulations, and watching the Omega he had discarded systematically dismantle the corrupt council and rebuild his kingdom. He slowly reached out, his thick, scarred fingers gently resting against the side of her swollen stomach. Instantly, a heavy, rhythmic kick answered his touch from within. Kalen's breath hitched, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips. "I was a fool, Ilara," he murmured softly. I let politics blind me to my own pack. I let them banish my heart to the mud. Ilara finally turned to him. She reached up, her small, smooth hands tracing the harsh lines of the silver scars visible above his collar. She had not forgotten the pain of her exile, but in the crucible of the grotto, they had forged something stronger than forgiveness. They had forged survival. "The river takes what is weak, Kalen," Ilara said, her voice a quiet, unyielding absolute. She leaned in, resting her forehead against his chest, listening to the heavy, scarred beat of his heart. "But what it leaves behind is iron." He was dying. The effort of swimming had cost him whatever time the yarrow had bought. Ilara dragged herself over the sharp rocks, her frozen hands frantically searching his chest for the pressure points to stop the bleeding. Before her fingers could find his arteries, the darkness of the riverbank was shattered by a blinding, mechanical floodlight. Ilara threw her arm up, shielding her eyes. The light was coming from a massive, iron-clad dreadnought anchored just 50 yards offshore, entirely bypassing the shallow tributaries. "I told you, Captain Vane," a smooth, chillingly aristocratic voice echoed from the deck of the ship, amplified by a brass speaking horn. "Fire flushes the rats, but they always run for the deep water. The ferrywoman is nothing if not predictable." Ilara's blood turned to ice. Stepping to the railing of the ship, silhouetted against the blinding light, was Beta Silas. He hadn't stayed in the safety of the Citadel. The warlord had come to personally ensure his throne was secure. "Bring them aboard," Silas ordered coldly, looking down at the bleeding, helpless Alpha King and the trembling Omega. "We wouldn't want his grace to drown before his execution." Rough, gauntleted hands seized Ilara's arms, hauling her violently from the shallow gravel and up the steep, rusted iron ramp of the dreadnought. She didn't fight them. She saved her rapidly depleting energy, her bare feet slipping on the slick, freezing metal. Behind her, it took 4 of Captain Vane's soldiers to drag Kalen. The Alpha King's massive body was dead weight, his boots scraping heavily against the ramp, leaving a horrifying thick smear of dark arterial blood in his wake. They were thrown onto the main deck. The freezing rain lashed at them, illuminated by the harsh, blinding glare of the ship's mechanical floodlights. The deck was a terrifying industrial maze of thick iron chains, steam pipes, and massive hydraulic cargo booms used to lift the hound cages. Ilara hit the grated steel floor hard, crying out as the impact jarred her wolfsbane poisoned hip. She immediately scrambled toward Kalen, throwing herself over his ruined chest to protect his open wounds from the freezing downpour. Kalen's eyes were half open, the golden irises dimming into a hollow, unfocused gray. His chest barely rose. The catastrophic tearing of his muscles in the rot sink had emptied him of his remaining blood volume. He was actively dying. "A tragic, poetic end," Silas's aristocratic voice purred, cutting through the drumming rain and the hiss of the ship's steam engines. The warlord Beta stepped into the circle of light. He was impeccably dressed in dark, dry leather armor, a heavy fur mantle draped over his shoulders. He looked down at them with a mixture of profound disgust and absolute victory. Vane stood at his right, his hand resting on the hilt of a silver broadsword. A dozen elite Iron Crown guards formed a tight perimeter, their crossbows leveled at the deck. "The mighty Alpha King drowned in the mud by a disgraced Omega," Silas mocked, pacing slowly around them. "History will record that you succumbed to rogue ambush wounds, and that the treacherous ferrywoman tried to steal your corpse for ransom. It is a narrative the Council has already swallowed." "You coward," Kalen breathed. The word was a wet, bubbling rasp, barely audible over the rain. His massive, trembling hand reached out, his thick fingers weakly curling into the fabric of Ilara's wet tunic, a final, helpless instinct to pull her behind him. Silas laughed, a cold, sharp sound. I am a pragmatist, Your Grace. You were weak. You wanted peace treaties with the border pacts. I want a continent, and the pack follows strength. Silas turned to Vane, his eyes narrowing into cruel slits. Behead him. Make it clean. I want the crown untouched. Vane drew his broadsword. The silver blade hissed against the scabbard, gleaming in the floodlights. No, Alara said. Her voice wasn't a scream. It was a cold, terrifyingly calm, absolute. She stood up. Her legs trembled violently, her blistered hands coated in Kaelin's blood. But she squared her shoulders. With a deliberate, forceful motion, she reached for the iron clasp at her throat and unhooked her heavy, soaked wool cloak, letting it drop to the steel deck. The freezing rain immediately plastered her thin linen tunic to her frame, clearly revealing the undeniable rounded swell of her stomach. More impactful than the visual was the sudden release of her scent. Unimpeded by the thick wool and the freezing water, the heavy, sweet, intoxicating pheromones of an Omega carrying royal pups exploded across the damp deck, instantly overriding the metallic reek of blood and engine oil. The reaction was instinctual, biological, and immediate. Every single soldier in the perimeter stiffened, their pupils blew wide, their nostrils flaring. The latent wolves beneath their skin recognized the most sacred, heavily protected scent in shifter biology, the bloodline of their true alpha growing in the womb. To harm a pregnant Omega carrying royal blood was the ultimate, unforgivable taboo. It was an act that invited a blood curse from the ancestors. Vane stopped dead in his tracks, his sword faltering. He looked from Ilara's stomach to the dying king, a profound horror draining the color from his scarred face. "What are you doing?" Silas barked, sensing the sudden, catastrophic shift in his men. "Kill him, and throw the whore in the river." No one moved. The guards lowered their crossbows, the heavy wood clattering against the iron grates. They were looking at Ilara with a dazed, protective awe. "I said kill them!" Silas roared, his aristocratic composure shattering into feral panic. He realized the biological mandate of the pack was overriding his political authority. Furious, Silas snatched the silver broadsword from Vane's limp grip. "If I must do it myself." Silas lunged forward, raising the heavy silver blade with both hands, aiming directly for Ilara's exposed stomach to end the bloodline and the king in one brutal sweep. Ilara didn't flinch. She had spent the last 2 minutes mapping the shadows of the deck. She knew she couldn't outrun a warrior. Beneath her, Kaelin's eyes snapped open. The dull gray ignited into a blinding, terrifying gold. He had no blood left, no muscle to stand, but an alpha's power was intrinsically tied to the soul. Drawing on the very last beat of his failing heart, Kaelin unleashed his aura, not as a blanket, but as a telekinetic weapon. "Submit!" Kaelin roared, the sound ripping through the air like a physical shockwave of localized gravity. The concentrated blast of dominance slammed into Silas mid-lunge. It wasn't enough to kill him, but it forced the warlord's nervous system to glitch, his knees buckling under the crushing pressure. He stumbled forward, the sword dropping to the deck with a clang, directly beneath the heavy shadow of the ship's main cargo crane. It was a 2-second window. Ilara pivoted, throwing her entire body weight forward. She lunged not at Silas, but at the massive, iron-toothed release lever of the hydraulic winch she had been studying since they were dragged aboard. Her blistered hands clamped around the freezing iron. She drove her good leg into the deck and pulled backward with the brutal, practiced strength of a woman who rode the dead against the river currents. The rusted pawl snapped back. The pressurized steam lock hissed violently, releasing its pressure. Silas looked up, his eyes widening in terror. Above him, the 2-ton solid iron tracking cage used to hold the hounds plummeted from the boom. The impact was deafening. The massive cage slammed into the steel deck, instantly crushing the warlord Beta beneath thousands of pounds of reinforced iron. The deck shuddered violently, and then a profound, eerie silence fell over the dreadnought, broken only by the hiss of venting steam and the relentless rain. Elara collapsed against the winch, her chest heaving, her hands bleeding freely onto the iron. She turned back to the center of the deck. The remaining soldiers had dropped to their knees, bowing their heads in absolute submission to the Omega who had defended the crown. But Kylan wasn't looking at them. His head had lolled to the side. The golden light had vanished from his eyes, leaving them completely dark. His chest had stopped moving. The Alpha King was dead. The silence on the iron deck was absolute, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain and the mechanical hiss of the dreadnought's steam vents. Elara stared at Kalen's still chest. The catastrophic blood loss and the lingering shock of the silver necrosis had finally stopped his massive heart. To the soldiers kneeling in a perimeter around them, the Alpha King was gone. But Elara was not just a grieving widow. She was the fairy woman. She knew the exact threshold between life and death, and Kalan had not yet crossed it. "Get up!" Elara roared, her voice tearing through the freezing downpour, shattering the soldiers' stunned paralysis. "You have bloodbinders and adrenaline in the ship's infirmary. Bring them to the deck, now." The sheer, undeniable authority in her voice, amplified by the biological mandate of the royal pups she carried, snapped the soldiers out of their trance. Two of Vane's former lieutenants scrambled to their feet, sprinting toward the lower decks. Elara threw herself over Kalen's ruined chest. She couldn't afford to worry about the torn muscles or the raw, weeping bullet holes. If his brain was deprived of oxygen for more than 4 minutes, not even an alpha's cellular regeneration could bring him back. She locked her blistered, bleeding hands together, centered them over his sternum, and drove her body weight down. Ribs cracked beneath her palms, the sound sickeningly loud. But she didn't stop. She pumped furiously, forcing the remaining blood to circulate through his massive frame. Her wolfsbane-laced hips screamed, her lungs burned, and her vision spotted with black dots of exhaustion. But she refused to yield. "You do not get to leave me with a continent to run," she ground out, tears of absolute defiance mixing with the freezing rain. The lieutenants returned, sliding across the slick deck with brass syringes of epinephrine and heavy canvas bandages. "Into the heart," Elara commanded, not breaking her rhythm. "Drive it through the chest wall." The soldier didn't hesitate. He plunged the long needle directly into Kalen's chest, deploying the massive dose of adrenaline. But Kalen remained still. His body was too hollowed out, the mate bond too fractured by the trauma to catch the spark. There was only one biological failsafe left. Elara stopped compressions. She collapsed against Kalen's neck, her face pressing into the cold, pulseless hollow beneath his jaw. She didn't kiss him. Acting on pure, primal instinct, she opened her mouth, bared her dull, human-like teeth, and bit down brutally onto his scent gland. It was a full, undeniable claiming bite. As her teeth broke his skin, she forcefully pushed every ounce of her will, her scent, and the frantic, instinctual terror of the pups in her womb directly into the severed mate bond. It was a biological shockwave, a massive, concentrated dose of maternal pheromones and unbroken tethering magic, demanding that the sire return to his pack. For 3 terrifying seconds, nothing happened. Then, beneath Elara's bloody hands, a massive, violent shudder racked Kalen's frame. His back arched off the steel deck as his heart seized the adrenaline and the bond's command, misfiring, stuttering, and finally locking into a heavy, thundering, chaotic rhythm. Kalen dragged in a horrific, ragged gasp of air, his golden eyes snapping open, blindly searching the rain. "We have a pulse," the lieutenant shouted in disbelief. "Bind his chest," Alara ordered, falling back onto the iron grates, completely spent. "Make full steam for the northern garrison. If he dies on the way, I will personally throw every one of you to the river." 6 months later, the air in the high balcony of the citadel smelled of sun-warmed stone, crushed lilies, and the steady, calm hum of thunderstorm ozone. Alara stood at the marble balustrade, looking out over the sprawling valleys of the Iron Crown territory. She was dressed in the deep crimson silks of the Luna, the fabric draping elegantly over the heavy, undeniable curve of her third trimester pregnancy. Behind her, the heavy oak doors of the Solar creaked open. Kalen stepped onto the balcony. The Alpha King was alive, but the river had extracted its toll. He moved with a heavy, pronounced limp, relying on a thick, silver-capped mahogany cane. The necrotic silver poisoning had permanently scarred the left side of his chest and shoulder, thick bands of twisted tissue that even his alpha healing could not erase. He was no longer the indestructible warlord, but the quiet, imposing gravity of his aura remained intact. "The northern and eastern rogue factions have signed the new treaties," Kalen said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble. He moved to stand beside her, leaning heavily on the balustrade. "Your trade proposals for the boundary waters sealed the negotiation. They trust the ferry woman. They do not entirely trust me." "They will learn," Alara said mildly, not looking away from the horizon. Kalen turned to look at her. The reverence in his golden eyes was absolute. There was no suffocating dominance in his gaze, only the profound respect of a king looking at his equal. He had spent the last 6 agonizing months recovering, learning the extent of Silas's manipulations, and watching the Omega he had discarded systematically dismantle the corrupt council and rebuild his kingdom. He slowly reached out, his thick, scarred fingers gently resting against the side of her swollen stomach. Instantly, a heavy, rhythmic kick answered his touch from within. Kalen's breath hitched, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips. "I was a fool, Alara," he murmured softly. "I let politics blind me to my own pack. I let them banish my heart to the mud." Alara finally turned to him. She reached up, her small, smooth hands tracing the harsh lines of the silver scars visible above his collar. She had not forgotten the pain of her exile, but in the crucible of the grotto, they had forged something stronger than forgiveness. They had forged survival. "The river takes what is weak, Kalen," Alara said, her voice a quiet, unyielding absolute. She leaned in, resting her forehead against his chest, listening to the heavy, scarred beat of his heart. "But what it leaves behind is iron. And that concludes the incredible survival story of Alara, the fairy woman, and Kalen, the Alpha King. Thank you so much for listening to this original high-tier werewolf romance. If your heart was pounding during that underwater escape or the final showdown on the Dreadnought, please smash that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another cinematic audio novel. What was your absolute favorite moment? Did you love Alara's tactical mind with the smokescreen? Or that epic, pulse-pounding revival scene on the Iron Deck? Let me know down below. I read every single one. Until next time, stay strong and beware the boundary waters.